Did Walt Disney hate his mother? It used to be a common question, or joke really, around my middle school lunch table. Between Snow White, Bambi, Cinderella, The Little Mermaid, and all the other ones after that, it seemed like a logical question for a kid to ask. Maternal figures in Disney movies were either absent, dead, or, as we'll discuss in this episode, evil. While it's perfectly understandable to use an absent or deceased mother to evoke sympathy in a main character, not to mention to keep the cast manageable, the recurring trope of the evil stepmother is more complex and difficult to grasp, but that doesn't make it any less interesting to explore. Hey there, story nerds, and welcome back to the Philosopher, where I discuss the themes, archetypes, and deeper meanings behind your favorite contemporary stories. Now, Tangled is one of my all-time favorite animated movies, perhaps one of my favorite movies ever. I find the story arc of that film to be pretty darn near perfect. But while meditating on what makes that movie work so well, I suddenly realized that there's a familiar story trope that's employed in Tangled without being explicitly stated, and that trope is, you guessed it, the evil stepmother. Now, I know Mother Gothel isn't exactly a stepmother, but she does fall under the umbrella category of what I'm going to call the broken mother, or the maternal figure who doesn't live up to the ideal. And this led me to research what it is about stepmothers that we find so fascinating, and, through the eyes of a child, pretty terrifying. This is by no means a modern invention. The trope of the evil stepmother goes all the way back to ancient Greek playwright Euripides. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Hopefully. But anyway, Euripides, who wrote, "Better a serpent than a stepmother." The word itself is derived from the Old English stop-killed. Again, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But it literally means one who becomes parent to an orphan. As I mentioned before, orphans are some of the most immediately sympathetic characters in fiction. So much so that a story mentor at a conference I work at once said that if you want to sell your book, put orphan in the title. So what makes the broken mother figure such a common villain, both in fairy tales and in general fiction? Well, I want to argue that there are three reasons we keep returning to the stepmother, each one deeper than the last. These concentric psychological circles will take us from the external world where stepmothers literally exist, all the way into the marrow of what makes us human. So let's dive right in. Did you know that in the modern world, children are 70 times more likely to be killed by a step-parent and 40 times more likely to be abused by one? That's pretty dark, right? Now, some people might try to explain this away as Darwinian principles or biological preference for one's own genetic offspring, but those statistics don't really hold in adoption situations, so clearly that's not true. I think there's something uniquely stressful about what might be called a knit-together family, or a family rebuilt after a catastrophe. And this makes sense, doesn't it? After all, what causes a step-parent to arrive on the scene? A death or divorce, both of which are supremely disruptive to childhood development. In fact, 25% of children from divorced families suffer from long-term issues, compared to 10% in non-divorced families. When you realize that these issues include drug addiction, depression, and even suicidal ideation, the stakes start to seem pretty high indeed. So why specifically stepmothers, and not just stepparents? Well, according to a 24-year study of 1,400 families done by Dr. E. Mavis Hetherington, children in knit-together families tended to stay resentful of stepmothers in a way that wasn't true of stepfathers. The children in these situations would come to accept and maybe even appreciate the new man in their life, but were much less welcoming to the new mom. Was it the stepmother's fault? In some cases, obviously not. Psychologists have found that in many divorce situations, fathers will often avoid the children from a previous marriage. This can be because of latent anger or bitterness about a divorce, or just due to their pain as a widower. This father might project onto his children the trauma he doesn't want to deal with himself. Oftentimes, due to biological loyalty, the children will, in these situations, will then project their hurt and abandonment onto the new figure who took away their father, namely the stepmother. Adding to this unfair bias against stepmothers is the fact that, while the expectations placed on a stepfather are fairly obvious, a stepmother's job is often vague and unspecified, and can be difficult to verbalize. This leads to instability and an idealization of the real mother or ideal mother, which we'll explore in more depth later. On the other hand, there are situations where the stepmother really is a villain, and that can lead to a nightmare situation. Abusive parents are unfortunately a reality that many children must live with. And while a tyrannical, violent, and oppressive father shows up in fiction as well, the abusive mother is, if possible, even worse. I would argue that this is because where male aggression is usually externally violent and contained to the physical world, female aggression is internal, psychological, and can sometimes lead to lasting damage. Or at least more lasting damage. Where abusive fathers might cause physical pain, abusive mothers withhold, punish, or strain the self-esteem of the victim in a way that is pernicious, insidious, and can be very difficult to cure. Which, I think, is exactly the kind of thing fairy tales were designed for. to help children deal with the most difficult aspects of life. This leads us to the historical context that is important to consider when evaluating the stepmother trope. We all know how brutal things were in the Middle Ages. I, for one, am very grateful to have been born in this century. Before the advent of electricity and penicillin, well, things were pretty rough. And the collected fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm reflect that. In the time when women often died of childbirth and men were forced to remarry for financial rather than emotional reasons, that remarriage could be more than just a psychological danger to the children of a previous relationship. The new wife might bring children of her own, who she will undoubtedly favor in a situation of scarce resources. This is shown in Cinderella, when Lady Tremaine tries to leverage the limited opportunity of an advantageous marriage for her own biological children, excluding the movie's namesake character for the good of her own blood. That's not really all that surprising in a medieval situation. Alternatively, as in Hansel and Gretel, the stepmother might make the cold decision to value herself over her children, especially if the children are not her own. For those of you who don't remember, Hansel and Gretel is a fairy tale about two children whose mother, during a time of great scarcity, talks their father into leading the brother and sister into the woods to die, so the parents no longer have to feed them. Yeesh. While in the woods, Hansel and Gretel discover the house made of candy, which of course is occupied by the evil witch, who they then defeat, returning home to find that their stepmother, who tried to kill them, died along with the witch. Now, interestingly, the original Hansel and Gretel, it's kind of a mouthful, the original Hansel and Gretel story had the actual biological mother choosing to leave her two children in the woods during what is believed to be the Great Famine that hit Europe from 1315 to 1317 AD. However, the Brothers Grimm decided, perhaps wisely, to change the mother character into a stepmother to make her decision more palatable, and also tied her to the evil witch in the forest to further hammer home the morality of the tale. But beyond even the pain that stepmothers have either historically caused or cause today, there is a final external world aspect to consider when discussing the evil stepmother trope, and that's the inherent human fear of the outsider. Stepmothers are outsiders. They are new elements in a previously known system, that of the family unit. And as outsiders, they are unknown and frightening for the child whose world has just been turned upside down, either by a death or a divorce. So no wonder they're ominous. And the Brothers Grimm knew perfectly well how much outsiders made good villains. In a way that seems pretty offensive to the modern-day sensibilities, these two writers would often choose to use foreigners as villains, equivocating African or Jewish characters with evil. That's pretty bad, right? And we all recognize how harmful and wrong that is now, but these fairy tales were assembled and reworked in the time of Napoleon, when nationalism and social unity were under threat by both literally and metaphorically invading cultures. And we can see even now in our modern world, the gut instinct fear of the outsider is a powerful reflex, and it shows up again and again in our political discourse. Whether it's literal outsiders from beyond our borders, or psychological outsiders from opposing intellectual factions, we both fear and hate those who are not in our tribe, and what tribe is more important than your immediate family? For a child who's recently suffered a major trauma, I can imagine the defensive instinct is jacked all the way to 11. In that way, the stepmother, the outsider, or the darkness at the edge of their explored little world is an easy scapegoat to project issues upon. And that's before her own failings as an imperfect human can even affect the story. Which leads us from the external world into the first psychological layer of the stepmother trope, and that is the representative loss of the ideal. In the physical world, stepmothers can present literal threats. But in the psychological landscape of a child, a stepmother can be the perfect symbol for what happens when an ideal situation is broken or lost, and the best representative of this is Cinderella. In the movie version of that fairy tale, either the original or the remake, the maternal forces are split evenly into the idealized perfect but unfortunately dead mother, and the evil withholding, punishing stepmother. In this way, all the discomfort of the tragic loss is placed squarely on one character, one symbol for everything that's gone wrong in the protagonist's life. And you'll notice that it's the fairy godmother who ends up saving the day, which I might argue represents the positive maternal swooping in to solve the problem that the negative maternal causes. In fact, in the original fairy tale, it's literally the dead mother's spirit who grows into a tree and protects Cinderella, eventually giving her the dress that lets her go to the ball and meet the prince. Now, obviously, things in real life are way more complicated than that. There aren't easy villains with which to attribute all the raw imperfection that plagues us all the time. But of course, fairy tales aren't real life. They're distilled versions of reality, simplified stories to, as we said before, help children deal with complicated situations. And the emotions children have toward parents, divorced or otherwise, can certainly get complicated. In a Freudian approach, we can deconstruct the stepmother trope even further as a functional way for children to deal with their real life. No, we're not talking about Oedipus complexes here, get your mind out of the gutter. According to Freud, as a child grows and begins to chafe against the tyrannical control of their parents, they start to feel resentful and angry towards their mother and father. These negative emotions produce a simultaneous feeling of guilt, since the child knows, maybe even subconsciously, that it's wrong to be angry at the people who love and care for you. But of course, the feelings remain. Therefore, the evil stepmother trope, or rather any story that employs an ideal mother figure and an evil mother figure, allows the child to split the abstraction of mother in two, giving them the freedom to hate the evil one and adore the good one. Therefore, even if a person has never experienced literal trauma or abuse from a stepmother figure, the viewer or reader can enjoy a kind of catharsis by hating the villainous abstraction of the parts of their parent that could be considered less than ideal. Young and old, we all grow to understand that our parents aren't perfect. Even if they did a great job, they probably made mistakes. And the process of maturing is also the process of coming to terms with the imperfections in what we thought the world should be. That process can be really painful and really confusing. Recognizing that our parents are mortals just like us is terrifying and can be a really hard thing for kids to understand. And like all story tropes, the evil stepmother exists to simplify and explain what we cannot describe ourselves. Which leads us to the very marrow of this episode, the innermost concentric circle at which the evil stepmother resonates as a trope, and that's as an archetype. According to Carl Jung, an archetype is a universal, archaic pattern or image that derives from the collective unconscious and represents the psychic counterpart of instinct. Oh boy. In other words, an archetype is a conceptualized part of our human experience, usually as a set of common images or a recurring trope, that hints at the deepest and most unknown parts of our psyche. Archetypes are passed on from century to century, perhaps tracing all the way back to the dawn of man, and are best used as a way to understand ourselves and the mysteries of our subconscious. Through this lens, I think that the evil stepmother could be considered a sub-archetype under the broader archetype of the mother. I think it wouldn't be wrong to use it as an abstraction of what happens when the feminine and maternal part of our own self goes wrong. Every archetype has a positive and a negative, a light and, as Jung would say, a shadow. The father archetype can either represent the protective, shielding, and instructive part of yourself, or the tyrannical, oppressive, and violent voice in your head. Likewise, the shadow side of the mother archetype, or the broken mother as I keep calling it, is the part of yourself that's withholding and punishing, the negative self-talk, the bad self-esteem. For a great example of this, let's look to Mother Gothel in Tangled. Again, one of my all-time favorite movies. Now, as I said, I know Mother Gothel isn't technically a stepmother, but I think she's a great example of the whole mother gone wrong theme that is synonymous with the evil stepmother trope. And Mother Gothel is horrible to Rapunzel. In the song Mother Knows Best, she literally says, "Why would he like you? Come now, really. Look at you. You think that he's impressed." In the Jungian understanding, Mother Gothel could represent the part of the viewer's psyche that is cruel and verbally abusive, the defeating inner voice that's holding us all back from our best life. Another example of this is the evil stepmother in Snow White, who hates the beauty and youth of the protagonist in the same way a person's evil stepmother might hate their own unrealized potential, or be envious of the person they were long ago when they had their whole life ahead of them. So if the evil stepmother is a part of all of us, a fractured and malicious piece of our minds, how do we fight it? Well, if you consult the fairy tales, they'll tell you. Like most things in life, defeating the evil stepmother in ourselves can only be done by facing her with truth and courage. Now, this is where the interpretation gets a bit dicey, because many of these fairy tales can perhaps be fairly criticized as patriarchal or male dominant, where a brave prince rides in and saves the helpless princess, damsel in distress person who can't save herself. But I think the counter to that argument is to continue to paint with Carl Jung's brush. If the princess is considered to be not a literal woman in the world, but a representation of the innocent, victimized feminine in us all, then it must be balanced by the experienced warrior masculine. In Snow White, after eating the apple, which could be used to symbolize knowledge, she falls into the unconscious and requires the masculine dwarves to defeat the witch and then the prince to wake her from sleep. In Tangled, Flynn Rider, also known as Eugene Fitzherbert, represents the confidence and knowledge and experience needed to save innocent Rapunzel from the oppressive mother. Now, this is only after Rapunzel has brought the situation to light through truthful speech. So it is through the integrated action of both sides of ourselves that the evil inside us, like Mother Gothel, can finally be defeated. So I don't think it's necessarily a sexist interpretation. In this way, what I think the fairy tales are telling us is that you can't have yin without the yang. You can't be balanced without acknowledging all the archetypes in your mind, and you can't defeat one's inner tyrant without utilizing all your strengths. It is only with your whole, unified, truth-seeking, and brave self that you stand a chance of defeating the monsters within you. It is interesting to note that the Grimm fairy tales, much like the Bible, act as more than simple wish fulfillment. After all, if they were just meant to make children feel good, there wouldn't be so much violence and starvation and just, frankly, horrible stuff in those things. No, I think fairy tales were never meant to tell us what should be, but rather deal with the world as it is. And that's why they endure in such a viral collective way. Evil stepmothers are more than just Disney characters, and they're more than just things to make the characters more sympathetic. They are deeply embedded in our cultural narratives, and therefore unlikely to disappear anytime soon. But there is a cost. While doing research for this episode, I came upon a lot of articles written by stepmothers trying to counter this trope. These women felt that their relationships with their new families had been poisoned by an immediately negative connotation. Their stepchildren went into the relationship already assigning all the baggage and shadow of the archetype without having the self-awareness to evaluate if it was fair. And with the divorce statistics in our world being what they are, this could be a dangerous thing going forward. So how can we both enjoy the storytelling tool of the evil stepmother while also avoiding the damage it might cause? Well, perhaps in the same way that the evil stepmother is defeated. With truthful speech, with thoughtful action, by understanding the world as it is and not just as we want it to be. And therefore by facing the dragons of our own complicated, flawed, creative, unknowable minds. Which is, after all, exactly what fiction is trying to do. I hope you've all enjoyed this episode of The Philosopher. If you like what I'm doing here, it would be hugely helpful if you left a review on iTunes or shared it with your friends. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, feel free to contact me on Twitter at Philosopher, leave a comment on YouTube, or email me at philosopher@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time.